She stepped off the stagecoach into a Montana morning and found three men standing where she had expected one. The letter had said Garrett Calloway, singular, one widower, one ranch, one proposition that had seemed sitting alone in Philadelphia with her lamp burning low, and a doctor's letter hidden at the bottom of her bag like the only honest offer she had received in 3 years. It had not mentioned his two brothers. It had not mentioned the six children. And it had not mentioned the secret she was carrying, the one that had closed every door before this one, the one she was certain would close this one too. She was wrong about that last part, but she would not know it yet for a long time. This is the story of what happened when Nora Whitfield stepped down onto the frozen ground of Bitterroot Falls with everything she owned in a single trunk and nothing to return to, and found in the most unlikely place the life she had stopped believing she was allowed to have. The letter said one man. The ranch had three brothers and six children who didn't want her. The stagecoach did not slow gently into Bitterroot Falls. It lurched, groaned, and shuddered to a stop the way exhausted things do when they have finally run out of road, and Nora Whitfield gripped the seat edge with both hands and told herself for the last time that she was not afraid. She was afraid. She had been afraid since Philadelphia. Since the morning she folded the advertisement from the newspaper and tucked it into the pocket of her traveling coat where it stayed for 11 days, before she finally answered it, growing soft at the creases from the number of times she had unfolded and refolded it. Since the moment she bought her ticket at the station window, and the clerk looked at her carpet bag, her single trunk, and the careful stillness of her face and did not ask a single question, because men like him had seen women like her before. Women traveling west with everything they own and nothing to return to, and he had learned not to ask. The door of the coach swung open. March cold rushed in, carrying pine and distance and the sharp clarity of mountain air that does not exist east of the Ohio River air, that announces itself, that insists you pay attention to where you are. Nora stepped down onto the frozen ground of Bitterroot Falls, Montana territory and stood still. Three men, not one, three. They stood in a line in the gray morning light, wide as the frame of the station doorway behind them, each one tall enough that Nora had to adjust her understanding of proportion to accommodate them. The mountain behind the town was enormous, and these three men occupied their portion of the world the way the mountain did, without apology, without explanation, simply by being exactly what they were. The one in the middle had dark brown hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of whiskey held up to firelight, and he wore the exhaustion of a man who had been managing too many things for too many years, without telling anyone how heavy they had become. He stepped forward. Miss Whitfield. His voice was low and even, not warm, not cold. The voice of a man who chose his words with the deliberateness of someone who did not intend to repeat them. I am Garrett Calloway. Nora looked at the letter in her hand. She had read it so many times that she could have recited it word for word, but she looked at it anyway because she needed the grounding of the paper between her fingers. The signature at the bottom read exactly what it had always read. Garrett Calloway. One name, singular. The letter had contained one name and a description of one ranch and one widower with six children and one proposition that had seemed sitting in her rented room in Philadelphia with her lamp burning low like the only honest offer she had received in 3 years. The letter had not mentioned the man standing to Garrett's left, broad through the shoulders, with sun-streaked hair and eyes that caught the light with something close to humor, or the one to Garrett's right, quieter in his posture, darker in his coloring, watching her with the careful attention of someone who notices things other people overlook. And the letter quite specifically had not mentioned the six children. They materialized from behind the men and around the corners of the station building with the restless energy of children who have been told to wait and have been waiting impatiently for longer than they consider reasonable. A girl of perhaps 13 stood in front with dark braids and a jaw set in a line so similar to Garrett's that there was no question of the relationship. Behind her, a boy of 11 or so, a girl who looked to be 9 or 10, two younger ones, a boy and a girl who seemed to operate as a unit, and tucked behind the oldest girl's skirts, gripping the fabric with small fists, A child of perhaps 4 years old, round-faced and watchful, staring at Nora, with eyes that had not yet decided whether she was safe. The stagecoach driver had already lifted her trunk down from the roof. Behind her, she could hear the wheels beginning to roll. The next scheduled departure back towards civilization was 5 days away. Nora looked at the man who had signed his name to a letter that had changed the direction of her life, and she said with the calm of someone who has already made her calculations and found no better alternative, "Your letter mentioned one name, Mr. Calloway." "It did," Garrett said. He offered no elaboration. The man to his left, the one with the sun-streaked hair and the not-quite-hidden amusement in his expression, bent down and picked up Nora's carpet bag without being asked. "2 hours to the ranch," he said conversationally, as if the situation were entirely ordinary, as if women arrived every Tuesday from Philadelphia to discover that the man who had written to them had failed to mention his 2 brothers and a collection of children large enough to populate a small schoolhouse. "Name's Fletcher. The quiet one is Weston. Garrett nails fences on time but has never successfully boiled an egg. The children are in order of height except for Eli, who is the youngest, and at present is hiding behind Adeline because he is not yet certain what to make of you." He said this last part with the practiced ease of a man who is accustomed to filling silences that other people find uncomfortable. Nora looked at the carpet bag now in Fletcher Calloway's hand. She looked at the trunk on the frozen ground. She looked at the 6 children arranged in descending height behind the 3 men, and at the oldest girl, Adeline, who was looking back at her with an expression that Nora recognized because she had worn it herself in a different life. It was the expression of someone who has been managing something too large for too long and has become in that management proprietary about the burden. The stagecoach rounded the bend and disappeared. "I'll take the trunk," Nora said. Fletcher's eyebrows rose slightly. Weston, who had not yet spoken a word, moved to the trunk instead and lifted it as though it weighed nothing, which, given the size of his arms, it probably did not. Nora walked toward the wagon. She did not let herself look at the mountains. Not yet. There would be time for that later, she told herself. First, she needed to understand what she had walked into. Then she could look at the mountains. The ride took 2 hours, as Fletcher had promised, and during those 2 hours, Nora learned several things. She learned that Fletcher Calloway had opinions about nearly everything and expressed them freely. She learned that Weston Calloway, seated in the back of the wagon with the trunk and the quieter children, had opinions about nothing he was willing to share in public. She learned that Garrett Calloway drove a wagon the way he apparently did most things, with economy and precision and without commentary, and that the children treated him with the mixture of trust and caution that children reserve for parents who are doing their best under circumstances that have asked too much of them. She learned that Adeline had not looked away from her since they left the station. She learned that Eli, the youngest, had fallen asleep against Adeline's side before they had traveled half a mile, and that Adeline had shifted her arm around him without breaking her surveillance of Nora, in the automatic way of someone who has been tending to this particular child for so long that the motion required no thought at all. And she learned, sitting in the cold mountain air, with the pines thickening on either side of the road, and the sky pressing down gray and heavy with the possibility of snow, that she had made a decision she could not unmake. She could stay. She could manage whatever this was, this situation that was more complicated than the letter had suggested and less impossible than the last 3 years of her life in Philadelphia had been. Or she could wait 5 days for the returning stagecoach and go back to a city where she had no prospects and no future, and a secret that followed her from one polite refusal to the next. She had not come this far to turn back. The ranch appeared at the end of a long dirt road that wound through a stand of pines so thick that the sky disappeared, and then the trees opened up, and there it was. A 2-story house of weathered wood with a porch that wrapped around 2 sides. A barn that had seen hard use and careful maintenance in equal measure. A smokehouse, a root cellar, a chicken coop from which, even at this distance, Nora could hear the self-important commentary of hens who have decided that the arrival of a stranger requires comment. It was not beautiful in the way that houses in Philadelphia were beautiful with their painted shutters and their window boxes and their proximity to gardens that someone else maintained. It was beautiful in the way that functional things are beautiful when they are exactly what they need to be. It sat in the land as though it had grown there, as though pulling it out would leave a wound. Garrett stopped the wagon in front of the porch and climbed down without ceremony. Kitchen is at the back of the house, he said. Bedroom is the second door on the left at the top of the stairs. Privy is behind the barn. Fletcher will show you the rest. He walked into the house. Fletcher, watching his brothers retreating back, made a small sound that was not quite a chai and not quite amusement. He's like that, he said to no one in particular. You get used to it. He's always been like that, said Owen, the 11-year-old, with the resigned authority of someone who has had considerable time to arrive at this conclusion. That night, after a supper that Nora cooked from what she found in the kitchen, which was plentiful but disorganized after the children had been sent to bed in the progressive stages that 6 children of different ages require. Garrett sat down at the kitchen table with Fletcher and Weston and looked at Nora across the surface of the wood that his father had cut from a tree on this land before Garrett was born. I should explain, he said. You don't have to explain, Nora said. I can see the situation clearly enough. The letter named only me because I thought it simpler. It is simpler, Nora said. It's also incomplete. Fletcher, sitting with his chair tipped back at an angle that had suggested long practice, watched this exchange with the expression of a man at a theatrical performance he has been anticipating for some time. The arrangement I propose stands, Garrett said. Your room, your privacy, $8 a month. You cook, you manage the house, you help the children with their schoolwork. After 12 months, if you want to leave, we provide the fare home. And if I want to stay, the question landed in the room with a weight that surprised all 3 of them, she thought. She had not meant it to sound like anything significant. She had meant it as a practical inquiry, but something in the way it fell into the silence between them made it larger than she had intended. Garrett studied her for a long moment. Then we discuss that when the time comes. Weston, who had not spoken since the station, set something down on the table and stood. It was a cup. Warm milk, not coffee, not tea, warm milk with what appeared to be a scraping of nutmeg across the surface. He did not explain it. He walked out of the kitchen and up the stairs, and his footsteps were so quiet on the boards that they barely registered. Nora looked at the cup. He does that, Fletcher said. Leaves things. Don't try to understand it. Just take it as the gesture it is. That night, lying in the narrow bed in the second room on the left, at the top of the stairs, Nora listened to the sounds of the ranch at night, which were entirely different from the sounds of Philadelphia at night. No carriages, no voices from the street below, no neighbor's piano through the wall, only wind, only the creak of the house settling into the cold, only the distant lowing of cattle somewhere in the dark, and once briefly the cry of something wild and unhurried from the trees to the north. She pulled the blanket up and stared at the ceiling and thought about the letter in her coat pocket, which was no longer necessary since she had arrived at the address it directed her to, and thought about whether she should have said what she did, that she might want to stay. She had not expected to feel that. Not on the first night, not when she still had to determine whether the oldest girl would ever look at her with anything other than armed wariness, and whether the youngest boy would ever come close enough for her to see the color of his eyes, and whether the man who had written the letter would ever say more than 12 words to her at a time. She had not expected to feel lying in the dark on the first night that she might already have arrived somewhere. In the morning, Nora came downstairs at 5:30 and found Adeline already in the kitchen. The girl stood at the work table with her back to the stairs, her dark braids still loose from sleep, kneading bread dough with the focused competence of someone who has performed this task so many times it has become as automatic as breathing. She did not turn when Nora's foot touched the bottom stair. She did not turn when Nora crossed the kitchen floor. She only said, without looking up, I usually do the breakfast. I can see that you do, Nora said, so you don't need to. I wasn't planning to take over, Nora said. I was planning to light the stove. A pause. The kneading continued. The damper sticks on the left side, Adeline said. You have to push it up before you pull it, or it won't draw properly. Nora found the damper, pushed it up, pulled it, and the stove accepted the wood she fed it with a soft, satisfied draft. They worked in silence for the better part of an hour. The girl making bread and Nora learning the kitchen, which was like the ranch itself, practical and worn and full of accumulated knowledge. The pots were hung in order of size. The flour was in a tin with a hand-painted flower on the lid that did not match the rest of the kitchen's aesthetics, and therefore Nora suspected had belonged to someone else, someone who had thought it worth the effort to paint a flower on a flour tin, someone who was not here anymore. She found the recipe book on the fourth day. She had been working her way systematically through the lower cabinets, reorganizing with the restraint of someone who understood that in a house that belongs to other people, you do not reorganize aggressively. You make small adjustments. You move things slightly closer to where they are most needed. You do not throw anything away. The book was in the bottom drawer, behind a coil of extra rope and a set of leather boot lacings and 3 smooth river stones that no one had thrown away because whoever collected them had once thought them worth keeping. It was small-bound in blue cloth that had faded to the color of a cloudy sky, and when Nora opened it, she found a handwriting that was not Garrett's. Rounded, careful, with the evenness of someone who had been taught penmanship by a patient teacher. Recipes, yes, but also notations in the margins. Observations. Instructions that were not about cooking. Eli cannot eat beans. His stomach gives him trouble, and he won't tell you, he'll just not eat, and you won't know why until you figure it out. Use potato instead. Adeline likes cinnamon in her cornbread. She won't ask for it. She never asks for things she wants. Add it anyway. Garrett never says the food is good. If he goes quiet through the whole meal and doesn't say anything at all, that means it's good. If he says something, even something small, it means it needs work. Fletcher will eat anything you put in front of him and tell you it's wonderful. Don't trust his reviews. Trust Garrett's silences. Weston sometimes leaves things on the kitchen table as a way of saying thank you. He's been doing it since he was 6 years old. A pine cone, a feather, whatever he found that day that seemed worth keeping. Take it the way it's meant. Nora sat on the kitchen floor with the blue book in her lap and read every page. Vivian Calloway had been thorough. She had written down not only how to cook for this family, but how to know them, how to read the language of people who had never learned to say plainly what they needed, because they had been raised on land that rewarded silence and competence over declaration. She had mapped the interior of her family the way a surveyor maps terrain, with careful attention to the details that determine safe passage. And she had done it because Nora realized she had understood that someday someone would need this map. Or perhaps she had just written it because she loved them and wanted to keep loving them even in the places she could not reach. Nora closed the book carefully. She did not put it back in the drawer. She set it on the kitchen table where she could see it while she cooked, and she did not mention finding it to anyone. In the days that followed, she began learning by doing. Owen was easy. He was 11 and curious about everything, and on the second morning he appeared at the kitchen doorway and said without preamble, "Is Philadelphia bigger than Bitterroot Falls?" And the conversation that followed lasted through the washing up and well into the preparation for supper, and by the end of it, Owen had decided with the authority of an 11-year-old who has received sufficient information to form an opinion that Philadelphia was probably too loud, but that the ocean was something he intended to see before he turned 30. Harriet at 9 watched. She did it openly without pretense, with the frank observation of a child who sees no reason to pretend she is not gathering data. On the third day, she left a blue hair ribbon on the kitchen table when she left for school. On the fifth day, she left it on Nora's bed. Nora wore it the following morning, tucked into the fold of her collar, and Harriet noticed and did not say anything, but spent the rest of the morning standing approximately 2 feet closer to Nora than she had on any previous day. Nate and Pearl moved as a pair, which they had apparently been doing since Pearl was old enough to follow Nate anywhere, and they accepted Nora with the adaptability of children who are still young enough to let new things into their world without extensive deliberation. They wanted to know if she could whistle. She could. They wanted to know if she had ever seen an alligator. She had not, but she described a painting she had once seen in a museum in sufficient detail to satisfy them. They told her about the time a badger got into the root cellar, and the story was long and digressive and required significant input from both of them simultaneously. And by the end of it, Nora had the strong impression that she had passed some informal evaluation whose criteria she did not fully understand, but whose result appeared to be satisfactory. Eli did not come near her. He was 4 years old, and he had his father's coloring and his oldest sister's wariness and the self-containment of a small child who has decided that attachment has consequences he is not yet prepared to risk again. He stayed close to Adeline. He watched Nora from whatever distance Adeline's proximity allowed. When Nora made cornbread on the fourth morning, using the recipe from the Blue Book with the cinnamon added for Adeline and the potatoes substituted for beans in the stew, Eli stood at the kitchen doorway and sniffed the air with the expression of someone receiving information they are not yet sure how to categorize and then retreated. But on the eighth day, he slipped on the back step. It was not a serious fall, a stumble really more startlement than injury. But he landed on his knee on the frozen ground, and there was a moment of the silent, suspended breath that precedes a child's cry, and Nora was the closest person. She picked him up. She checked his knee, which had a scrape, but nothing worse. She blew on it gently the way her own mother had done, which was irrational from a medical perspective, but universally effective from a comfort perspective. Eli looked at his knee. He looked at Nora. He did not pull away. He let her set him on the porch railing and examine the scrape, and he looked at somewhere to the left of her face with the elaborate studied inattention of a child who does not want to be caught admitting that something helped. She set him down when she was done. He walked away without looking back. But he did not hide behind Adeline when Nora entered a room after that. She noticed. She did not make anything of it. She filed it away in the same place she was filing everything about this family carefully and without pressure, the way you handle things that might break if you hold them wrong. Adeline was a different matter. On the evening of the first week, Nora came into the kitchen and found Adeline standing at the stove stirring a pot of soup with the concentration of someone who is determined that if the soup is perfect, some larger problem will be solved. The soup smelled fine. The problem Nora suspected had nothing to do with soup. "I can finish that," Nora offered. "I have it." "I know you do." Nora sat down at the kitchen table. "I was offering, not taking over." Adeline stirred. The fire in the stove popped. "I've been doing this since Mama died," Adeline said. Not accusingly, factually, as if she were reading from a report. "I know," Nora said. "I can see that you have, and I can see that you have done it well. So I don't need help." "Maybe not," Nora said, "but you're 13 years old, Adeline. 13 is old enough to do what you've been doing. It is not old enough to do it forever without anyone to share it." Adeline's stirring slowed slightly. "Mama did it." "Your mother was older when she started than you are now, and she had a mother of her own to teach her and time to learn without being in charge while she was learning." Nora kept her voice quiet, not soft, not placating, just quiet. "I'm not trying to take her place. I could not do that. I'm not trying to change anything that she was. I'm here to help. That's all. You can let me do that or you cannot, and I will still be here either way." Adeline did not respond, but the stirring continued, and she did not tell Nora to leave the kitchen. And when the soup was done and she ladled it into bowls, she handed the first bowl to Eli without being asked, and the second to Pearl without looking, and did not seem to notice that she had allowed Nora to set the table behind her while she did it. That was how things began. Not with reconciliation, not with acceptance, with the smallest possible loosening of a grip that had been held too tight for too long, and with both of them pretending for the sake of the evening that it had not happened. On the ninth evening, a woman from town came to the ranch. Her name was Prudence Yates, and she was the wife of the man who ran the general store in Bitterroot Falls And she came with fabric and conversation and the social energy of someone who considers it her responsibility to know everything that happens within a 20-mile radius. She looked at Nora the way a woman of her generation looks at a woman of Nora's situation, assessing and categorizing with practiced efficiency, and she found apparently that the assessment was acceptable because she sat down at the kitchen table and accepted a cup of coffee and began talking. "You look settled in already," she said. "Garrett must be relieved. 3 men and 6 children is no small thing. I always said he'd manage himself right into the ground before he asked for help." "He asked," Nora said. "He did," Prudence said. "That took something for a man like him." She looked around the kitchen with approval. "You've straightened things up already. Vivian kept this kitchen beautifully, of course, but after she passed, the men let it get away from them." She paused. "You know about Vivian?" "I know she was Garrett's wife," Nora said carefully, "and that she was well loved." "She was remarkable," Prudence said simply. "This whole valley loved her." She set her cup down and looked at Nora with the directness of someone who has decided that directness is more efficient than delicacy. "It'll take time with Adeline. She and her mother were very close, but she's a good girl. She'll come around." Nora said something polite in response. Prudence smiled. "And I imagine by next spring we'll be hearing the happier news about the family growing a bit more." She said it warmly, meaning it kindly the way women say such things when they are simply following the natural progression of assumptions. That would do these children so much good. The sentence hit Nora in the place where the information lived that she had been carrying for 3 years. The medical fact folded in the bottom of her carpet bag like a stone she could not put down, and she felt it land with the familiar weight that it always carried when someone said something like this, which was often because it was what people expected, and expectation was its own kind of grief when you could not meet it. She smiled. It was a good smile. She had practiced it until it looked natural, until no one who saw it would know it was constructed rather than felt. It showed warmth and appropriate pleasure at the prospect being described and gave nothing away of the hollow place it covered. "Time will tell," she said. Fletcher was standing in the doorway. He had come in for a pair of work gloves he had left on the peg near the kitchen door, and he was there for perhaps 30 seconds before he turned and left. But Nora was aware of him with the peripheral awareness she had developed in the past week, the awareness of a woman in a house full of people who might need something at any moment. She was not certain from the angle that he had seen her face when the sentence landed. She did not look directly at him to find out. After Prudence Yates left, Nora went to the garden behind the house to collect the last of the winter kale, which was mostly for the chickens at this point, but gave her a reason to be outside in the cold air until the hollow feeling passed back down to the place where she kept it. She worked methodically through the frost-stiffened plants, pulling and stacking her breath, making small clouds in the darkening air. Fletcher came out 20 minutes later and sat on the back step without explanation. He did not ask how she was. He did not comment on what had happened. He simply sat there in the cold in his shirt sleeves, with his work gloves on his knees, and was present in the way that some people are present in filling space without demands. After a while, he said, "She means well. Prudence, she just doesn't always consider what her words land on." "Most people don't," Nora said. "True enough." They stayed there until the light failed completely, and the cold made continued outdoor habitation unreasonable. And then they went inside, and Fletcher made terrible coffee, and Nora did not say it was terrible. And the evening moved into night with the ordinary rhythms of a household finding its pattern. It was on the 11th night that Garrett knocked on the frame of the kitchen doorway. Late past the children's bedtime, while Nora was mending a tear in Owen's school trousers by lamplight. She had thought the house settled. She had not heard him come downstairs. He stood in the doorway with a lamp of his own and something in his other hand, an envelope, worn at the edges as though it had been carried for some time. "I should have included more information in the letter," he said. Nora set down the trousers. "You probably should have." He crossed the kitchen and set the envelope on the table in front of her. She opened it. Inside was a document several pages legal in its language. She read the first page carefully and then looked up. "Your father's will," she said. A copy of the relevant section. Garrett sat down across from her, his lamp between them, casting two small circles of warmth in the larger dark. The ranch was left to the three of us jointly with a condition. A woman of lawful standing must reside permanently at Callaway Ranch no later than the 6th anniversary of the document, or the property must be sold and the proceeds divided equally. That anniversary is 7 months from now. That's why you advertised. It is. He said it without apology, which Nora found she preferred to false contrition. The children needed someone, and the ranch needed the legal standing, and I thought it more honest to say so plainly. It is honest, Nora said. I can appreciate that. She turned the pages, reading further, and then she found the line near the end that stopped her. She read it twice to be certain of its meaning. Should the aforementioned woman depart voluntarily prior to completing 1 full calendar year of residency, the condition shall be considered unmet. She looked up. 12 months, she said, not 7. To protect the condition, I would need to stay 12 months. Yes. And after 12 months, if I wish to leave, we would provide the fair home. His voice was the same, even measured, giving nothing away. If you wish to stay, we would discuss that then. Nora folded the document and placed it back in the envelope. She thought about Philadelphia. She thought about the room at the top of the boarding house where the window faced the alley, and the sounds from below at night were never quiet enough to sleep through properly. She thought about the 3 years of careful smiles and practical calculations and the stone she carried everywhere, the medical facts she could not put down. She thought about Eli's face when she blew on his scraped knee. She thought about the blue recipe book with its careful notations in the margins, written by a woman who had loved her family precisely enough to leave a map for the person who would come after. There is something I should tell you, Nora said. Garrett looked at her. He did not say anything. He simply waited with the patience of someone accustomed to letting things come at their own pace. Not tonight, she said, but soon. There is something you should know that I did not include in my letter. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not alarm, not suspicion, the slightest recalibration of a man who does not often encounter variables he has not anticipated. All right, he said, I will tell you when I'm ready. All right, he said again and stood and took his lamp and went back upstairs. And Nora sat alone in the kitchen with the document and the mending and the lamplight, listening to the wind move around the corners of the house that had been here before she arrived and would be here long after whatever happened between now and 12 months from now. She put her hand in the pocket of her apron and felt the edge of the small, folded paper that had lived in one pocket or another for 3 years worn soft at the creases, carrying in its careful medical language a truth that had shaped every decision she had made since she was 19 years old. She had told no one here. She had told no one anywhere, not without being forced to. Because every time she had told, the door had closed, sometimes gently, sometimes not, but always closed. She was going to tell Garrett Callaway. Not tonight, but soon. She had come too far and found too much here to let the telling wait until it chose its own moment. The choice needed to be hers. Outside, the wind picked up and the house settled deeper into the Montana night. And somewhere upstairs in the second room from the right, a 4-year-old boy was sleeping with his fist curled under his chin, and he had let a stranger blow on his scraped knee and had walked away without looking back, and had not hidden behind his sister this morning when she came into the room where he was eating breakfast. Small things. But Nora had learned in the course of a life that had required her to pay careful attention to small things, that small things were often where the large ones began. She folded the mending, turned down the lamp, and went upstairs to the second room on the left, where the window looked out over the dark fields and the mountains. She had promised herself she would see in time stood invisible in the dark but present in the air, and she lay down on the narrow bed and did not cry. She had made her decision. Now she would see what it made of her. The second week at Callaway Ranch arrived with 6 inches of new snow, and the discovery that the root cellar door had warped over the winter and could no longer be opened from the outside without a particular technique involving a simultaneous lift and pull that Garrett had apparently communicated to no one. Because when Nora went to retrieve the stored carrots on Monday morning, she spent 11 minutes in the cold, before Weston appeared from the direction of the barn, observed her situation without comment, and demonstrated the lift and pull method with the wordless efficiency of a man who has performed a task so many times he has forgotten that other people might not already know how to do it. He held the door while she went down. When she came back up with the carrots, he had already walked back to the barn. This was she was learning, entirely characteristic of Weston Calloway. He appeared when something needed doing. He did it without discussion. He disappeared before any acknowledgement could be offered or received, as though the exchange of gratitude made him uncomfortable in a way that the work itself did not. On the kitchen table that evening, she found a bundle of dried sage tied with a strip of leather. She had not asked for sage. She had on Thursday of the previous week mentioned to no one in particular that the potato soup smelled better with it. He had been in the room when she said it. She put the sage in the proper place in the kitchen cabinet and did not mention it at supper. Fletcher noticed her not mentioning it and said, "You're getting the hang of things." Garrett said nothing, which according to the blue recipe book meant the potato soup was good. The arrangement of daily life settled into shape gradually the way things do when the people involved are too busy and too practical to spend much energy on deliberate negotiation. There were things that needed doing, and there were people available to do them, and the allocation happened through a combination of capacity and necessity and the slow accumulation of small understood agreements. Nora managed the kitchen and the house. She cooked 3 meals a day for 9 people, which required a degree of organizational thinking that she had not fully anticipated until she was doing it, because the difference between cooking for one person in a Philadelphia boarding house and cooking for 9 people on a Montana ranch in 1873 was not merely a matter of quantity. It was a matter of timing and temperature, and the internal logic of a wood-burning stove that had its own personality, its own preferences, its own ways of communicating displeasure. The stove at Callaway Ranch ran hot on the left side and cool on the right, and communicated this information through the relative color of whatever was baking at any given moment. And it took Nora 4 days and 2 batches of uneven biscuits before she understood the stove's character well enough to work with it rather than against it. She managed the mending, which was considerable. 6 children generate an impressive volume of torn fabric, and 3 men who work with their hands and their bodies in conditions that are not gentle on clothing generate more. She did the washing on Tuesdays and Fridays. She tended the kitchen garden, which in March required mostly preparation rather than active cultivation, turning the frozen soil where it could be turned and planning what would go where when the ground softened enough to receive seeds. She helped Owen and the younger children with their schoolwork in the evenings. Owen was working through an arithmetic primer with the intensity of a child who has decided that numbers are a puzzle he intends to solve. Harriet read well above her age and had opinions about everything she read and expressed them directly when invited, and sometimes when not. Nate and Pearl were at the age where letters were still a negotiation, and reading required concentration that competed with everything else that was happening in their immediate field of attention, which was considerable. Nora learned to work with their attention rather than demanding it to make the learning feel incidental, a thing that happened while other things were happening, and this approach worked well enough that by the end of the second week, Nate had read an entire page without stopping and looked up with the satisfaction of someone who has discovered they can do something they were not certain they could do. The world outside the ranch made its presence felt. Bitterroot Falls was not a large town, but it was substantial enough to have a general store and a post office and a sheriff's office and a church in the social ecosystem that forms wherever enough people live in proximity to develop opinions about each other's business. Garrett drove the wagon into town on Saturdays for supplies, and on the 3rd Saturday he asked without particular ceremony whether Nora wished to come. She came. The town received her with the calibrated curiosity of a community that has been anticipating the arrival of something new and has prepared numerous opinions about it in advance. Prudence Yates introduced her to 6 women in the first 20 minutes. The man behind the counter at the hardware store whose name was apparently Beaumont, and who had the comprehensive knowledge of regional gossip that is common to men in his profession, welcomed her with a warmth that contained precisely the right amount of inquiry disguised as friendliness. A man named Silas Dodd, standing outside the land office with the stillness of someone who was watching, rather than merely being present, observed Nora's arrival with an expression she could not read and did not like, and filed away for future reference. Garrett handled the supply negotiations with the directness of a man who has been trading with the same people for years and has no patience for the social preliminaries that sometimes precede commerce. He did not introduce Nora as anything in particular, which was both considerate and she recognized deliberately ambiguous. There was a legal question outstanding. Until it was resolved, the ambiguity was probably prudent. Fletcher, who had come along ostensibly to help with the loading, and actually because he enjoyed town in the way that social people enjoy any environment that provides them with an audience, spent the morning talking to everyone. He reported back to the wagon at noon with a comprehensive accounting of recent events in Bitterroot Falls that included two property disputes, a dispute about a fence line, the impending arrival of a circuit preacher who was expected to stay for 2 weeks, and the information that Silas Dodd had recently been asking questions at the land office about the Callaway property. Garrett did not react to this last piece of information in any visible way. Nora noted the absence of a reaction and concluded that the information was not new. She did not ask about it, not yet. The skill lessons began in the 3rd week because practical necessity generated them in the same way it generated everything else at the ranch. "If there's an emergency when none of us are here," Garrett said one morning, appearing in the kitchen doorway with the direct economy of a man who has decided something and is announcing the result rather than proposing it for discussion, "you need to know how to reach town. That means you need to know how to ride." Nora had ridden occasionally in Philadelphia. Carriages and the social equestrian activities that women of a certain social class were expected to participate in. She had not ridden in the way that Montana required riding, which was less about elegance and considerably more about the practical management of large animals across terrain that did not cooperate with the idea of a pleasant outing. Fletcher gave the lessons. He was unexpectedly an excellent teacher, patient in the way that people who love something are patient when sharing it not out of suppressed impatience but out of genuine pleasure in watching someone else discover what they already know. He did not talk down to her. He explained the horse first, the animal's logic, the way it processed information, and communicated through the set of its ears and the tension in its body. And once Nora understood the horse, she found the riding followed more naturally from that understanding. "You're thinking too much," he said on the 2nd lesson, when she was managing the turn correctly, but with a concentration visible from 20 yards. "You're telling your hands what to do. Let your hands know what to do. There's a difference." "That distinction doesn't make sense yet," Nora said. "It will." He rode up alongside her and put his hand over hers on the reins, showing rather than telling, adjusting the angle and the pressure with the precision of someone who has done this so many times it is stored in his hands rather than his conscious mind. "Like that. Feel that, yes." He moved his hand back. She tried it. It was better. The lessons happened 3 mornings a week early before the heaviest work of the day began. They became without either of them deciding this the occasion for conversation. Not the focused economical exchange of information that characterized most communication at the ranch, but actual conversation, the kind that covers territory, because two people are moving through space together and their minds are doing something similar. She learned things about Fletcher's Callaway that she had not known from observation alone. He had been the middle brother from birth, which meant he had spent his childhood navigating between Garrett's gravity and Weston's silence, and had developed his sociability as a form of translation, a way of making what those two contain legible to the world outside. He had a quick intelligence that expressed itself as humor, which was not the same as not taking things seriously. He had never left Montana and had no desire to, which surprised her until he described the quality of the light in the fall when the aspens turned, and then it surprised her less. She told him things in return, not the large thing, not yet, but smaller things, true things, the texture of a life in Philadelphia that had been quieter and lonelier than she had told herself at the time. The boarding house, the seamstress work, the kind of invisible that a woman becomes when she is not connected to anyone, when she moves through a city that does not hold her name. That sounds like a hard way to live, Fletcher said. It wasn't dramatic, Nora said. It was just very quiet. He considered this for a moment, riding beside her through the cold, clear morning. Quiet isn't always bad. No, she agreed, but quiet that comes from absence is different from quiet that comes from peace. He looked at her with an expression she could not fully read. Then he nodded once and turned his horse back toward the fence line and said, "Try the canter again. Remember what your hands know." Weston's language of small objects continued throughout the third and fourth weeks. A small carving left on the kitchen table, a bird in flight, compact and precise, executed in a pale wood that caught the morning light and held it. She ran her thumb over the smooth curve of the wing and thought about what it had cost in time and attention, and put it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink where it would catch the most light. A jar of preserved wild berries. A bundle of pine needles tied so tightly that they smelled when she pressed her nose to them of the entire forest north of the ranch. A smooth stone the color of storm clouds with a single white vein running through it like a crack that healed. She did not return these gifts with speech. She understood from the recipe book and from her own growing knowledge of the man that what he was doing did not require verbal acknowledgement and might in fact be diminished by it. She acknowledged them with action. She used the sage in the cooking. She kept the carving on the windowsill. She found a use for the preserves that made them visible and consumed, because waste was the only ingratitude this particular language could recognize. Once catching him watching from the doorway, as she sliced bread near the windowsill, where the carved bird sat, she simply nodded. A small, deliberate nod that meant, "I see what you leave. I understand what it means. Thank you." He looked at the bird for a moment. Then he walked back outside. But on the table that afternoon, there was a second carving. A small, round figure, not a bird this time. A woman standing upright, looking forward. She did not put that one on the windowsill. She kept it in her room. It was during the fifth week, on an evening when the cold had finally decided to give way to the first tentative suggestion of spring, and the window above the kitchen sink had been opened 2 inches for the first time since Nora's arrival, that Adeline appeared in the barn when Nora was looking for an extra lamp wick. She was not crying. She had clearly been crying in the recent past in the way that makes a person's face carry the evidence, even after they have regained composure. She was sitting in the bay of old straw behind the second stall knees, drawn up, arms around them, in the posture of someone who needed a private place, and had chosen this one because it was the least likely to be interrupted. Nora found the lamp wick she could have left. She sat down in the straw a few feet away, not close, not crowding, and said nothing. The barn held its warmth, animal and hay-scented and low-ceiling, the kind of warmth that has nothing to do with fire. After a long while, Adeline said, "Today was her birthday." Nora did not ask whose. She knew. 19th of April, Adeline said. Her voice was controlled and flat in the way voices become when control has been applied very deliberately. Nobody said anything. Papa probably remembered. He doesn't say things like that out loud. Fletcher might have forgotten. Weston doesn't forget things, but he wouldn't say it either. A pause. I don't know if the little ones even know when it was anymore. Eli was only 2. What would she have wanted today? Nora asked. Not what would you have done for her. What would she have wanted? Adeline's arms tightened around her knees. She liked mornings best, she said. She'd get up before everyone else and just sit on the porch and look at the mountains. She said that was her time. A long silence. She made apple cake on her own birthday. She said it was backwards, but she liked making it more than receiving it. Apple cake with caramel. Adeline's head turned sharply. How do you know that? Nora had not meant to reveal the source, but there was no useful deception available. I found her recipe book, she said, in the kitchen cabinet. I hope you don't mind that I've been using it. Something crossed Adeline's face that was complicated enough to take several seconds to pass. She wrote things in the margins, she said finally. She wrote about all of you, Nora said, about what you each liked and needed. She knew her family very well. Adeline looked at the straw in front of her feet. She would have been 41 today, she said. There was no good response to that. Nora did not try to construct one. She sat in the warm dark of the barn and let the number exist in the air between them without doing anything to it. I don't know how to make the caramel, Adeline said after a while. She only showed me once and I forgot the part about when to stop cooking it. I know how, Nora said. If you want to make it tomorrow, she put a note in the margin about the color. Adeline looked at her. For a moment, the 13-year-old armor was visible for exactly what it was, armor. And under it, something much younger and much more raw that had been carrying far more weight than it should have been asked to bear. Mama would have liked you, she said. It came out small and certain, not as a comfort offered, but as a fact stated. She liked people who paid attention. Nora let the words settle before she spoke. That means a great deal to me, she said, and she meant it entirely. They made the apple cake the next morning before the children came down for breakfast, before Garrett and his brothers had come in from the early chores. Adeline stood at the stove and Nora stood beside her, and they worked from the blue recipe book with the note in the margin about the caramel, and the window was open 2 inches and the spring air came in, and the kitchen filled with the smell of apple and sugar, and something that was not nostalgia exactly, but was related to it, the knowledge that the things we carry from the people we have lost are not less real for being carried. When it was done, Adeline stood back and looked at it. She did not cry again, but she touched the edge of the book with one finger gently as though greeting someone. Thank you, she said. She said it to the book as much as to Nora, and Nora understood that and received the portion that belonged to her without claiming any of the rest. The argument with Garrett happened in the last week of April, and it happened because Nora was right and Garrett did not like it, which was, she would later think, perhaps the most illuminating thing that had yet occurred between them. He had decided to sell 4 of the milk cows to settle a debt on seed barley. The decision had a financial logic that she followed when he explained it, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger open between them, because he had in the 4th week begun explaining certain ranch decisions to her, not asking her opinion, simply explaining them in the way that suggests a person has started to consider someone else present enough to warrant accounting for. She listened to the explanation. She thought about what the recipe book said about Eli's digestion. She thought about the winter stores. She thought about the supply run to Bitterroot Falls and the prices Garrett had negotiated for dairy and the arithmetic of a ranch that was 4 days from the nearest significant town and could not supplement its stores easily. 4 cows is too many, she said. Garrett looked up from the ledger. Those 4 are the primary milk source for the household through winter, she said. If you sell them now, you're trading 6 months of reliable nutrition for the children for seed money that won't return a yield until fall at the earliest. I know the yield timeline, Garrett said with a patience that was not quite as patient as it sounded. Then you know that between now and fall, Eli's stomach will suffer for the lack of milk. And Pearl still needs it, and Harriet drinks more of it than she'll admit. Nora kept her voice even. She was not angry, she was certain. Those were different things, and it was important to know the difference. Sell 2, keep 2. The debt gets partially covered, and the household keeps its foundation. The silence that followed had a quality. It was not the silence of a man absorbing new information. It was the silence of a man who has processed new information and is now determining what to do with the fact that a woman who has been in his house for 5 weeks has just altered his thinking. 2, he said, not I was wrong, not you're right. 2, the decision changed and he stated the new decision and moved forward, and Nora understood that this was as much acknowledgement as Garrett Calloway was built to give and received it accordingly. Fletcher, who had been at the other end of the kitchen, ostensibly cleaning a bridle, but actually listening with the undisguised interest of someone who has waited several weeks for exactly this kind of exchange, said nothing at all. But when Nora passed him on her way out to the garden, he said quietly, "He's going to respect you more for that than for anything else you've done since you got here." "I didn't do it for his respect," Nora said. "I know," Fletcher said. "That's why." The evening of the 8th Saturday, Nora came downstairs after the children were in bed and found the kitchen empty except for Garrett, who was sitting at the table with a week-old newspaper and a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he read. She made a fresh pot and set a cup near his elbow without comment and sat down with her mending, and they occupied the kitchen together in a silence that had changed character from the silence of the first days. The first silence had been assessment. This one was something else. "Tell me about your father," Nora said. She had meant to ask something smaller, something safer, but it was late, and the kitchen was warm, and the question came out of whatever part of her had decided the smaller questions were taking too long. Garrett set down the newspaper. He did not look surprised by the question. He considered it. "Fair," he said at last. "The fairest word I know for him. He had standards, and he held to them, and he expected you to hold to yours, and he did not penalize you for failing if you had tried honestly, only if you had not tried." He turned the coffee cup slightly in his hands. "He adopted the three of us from different circumstances when we were young. He never treated the circumstances as relevant to anything. He said a man is what he does with what he has, not what he came from." "He was right," Nora said. "So?" "Yes," Garrett looked at her. "You chose that just now. You could have said something polite. You chose agreement." "I agreed," Nora said simply. "I thought it would be dishonest to soften it into something less." He held the look for a moment longer than he usually held things, and in the lamplight she could see the quality of his attention, which was not warm in the way that Fletcher's was warm, not quiet in the way that Weston's was quiet, but concentrated. The attention of someone who does not distribute it freely and is therefore more significant when it is given. "What did you want to tell me?" he asked. "That night in the kitchen. You said there was something." Nora set down her mending. The moment had found itself without her making a decision about it, the way certain necessary things do. The kitchen was warm and the lamp was burning steady, and the house was quiet around them. And she had been carrying the folded paper in her pocket for 8 weeks, and she realized, tired. "There is something I should have told you in the letter," and she said. "I did not, because every time I have told the conversation ended and the door closed, and I was afraid this one would too." She held his gaze. "I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." Garrett set down his coffee cup. He folded his hands on the table. He said, "I'm listening." And Nora Whitfield, in the kitchen of a ranch in Montana that she had lived in for 8 weeks and had not expected to feel anything about, told Garrett Calloway the truth she had been carrying for 3 years. She told it plainly, the way she had learned to tell difficult things without softening the medical language and without dramatizing its consequences. The scarlet fever, age 19. The damage. The doctor's letter, which she had kept because somewhere in her she needed the material reality of the paper, even though she had memorized every word. The 3 years. The 4 families. The shape of an absence that is not grief for a loss you experienced, but grief for a future you will not have. She told him about the advertisement she had read 11 times before answering, about the phrase "no children required immediately," which had seemed, when she was sitting in Philadelphia by lamplight, like a door slightly ajar in a row of closed ones. She told him that she had come here hoping to be useful, hoping to be present, hoping that whatever she could offer might be enough, even if it was not what was usually expected. Then she stopped. The fire in the stove shifted. Outside, the spring wind moved through the yard. Garrett looked at the table for a long moment, not at the coffee cup, at the wood grain of the table his father had cut from a tree on this land before any of them were born. "The will," he said finally, "says nothing about children." "I know. This ranch has 6 of them." "I know that too." He looked up. The concentration of his attention was unchanged, and now she could see in it something she had not been able to read before: the stillness of a man who has made a decision and is waiting for the right moment to say it. "You came here afraid," he said, "and you came anyway." "Yes." And you stayed 8 weeks and did not tell me, and in those 8 weeks you made an apple cake with my daughter on her mother's birthday and salvaged my livestock decision and learned my youngest son's dietary needs from his mother's handwriting." He paused. "That is not the behavior of someone who is hiding. It is the behavior of someone who was afraid," Nora said, "which is not the same thing but is not entirely different either." "No," he agreed, "it is not." He stood. "I need to speak with Fletcher and Weston tomorrow morning." "I understand. Tonight you sleep without worrying about tomorrow morning." He picked up his lamp. Then at the doorway he paused without turning. "You asked me once why I keep a ranch this far from town with this much work and this little help." He had not in fact been asked this, but she understood that he was going to answer a question she had not yet thought to ask. "My father said, home is not the place you come from. It is the place you keep choosing." He looked at the doorway frame. "I have kept choosing this place for 34 years. It does not require explanation." He went upstairs. Nora sat alone in the kitchen with the lamp burning and the spring wind outside and the folded paper in her pocket that was, she thought, perhaps a little lighter than it had been an hour ago. Not weightless, it would never be weightless, but lighter. The morning came with clear, cold air and the smell of pine and the early light in Montana that seems to arrive from the mountains, first touching the high peaks with gold, while the valley is still gray, moving downward as the sun rises until the whole landscape is illuminated from the earth up. Nora came downstairs at 5 and made coffee and began breakfast. And at 5:30, Garrett and Fletcher came in from the early barn work, and at 5:45, Weston came in behind them. And they all sat down at the kitchen table, and Nora stayed at the stove because this was not the moment to sit down. And then Garrett looked at her and said, "You should be here for this." She came to the table. She told the three of them what she had told Garrett the night before. She told it the same way, plainly, without softening or dramatizing her eyes moving from one face to the next, because she was not willing to look at the table while she said it. Fletcher put down his coffee cup. He reached across the table and refilled her cup from the pot that was already in his hand without any ceremony, without any performance of compassion. He just refilled her cup. The gesture was so ordinary and so deliberate that it was somehow more steadying than any more elaborate response could have been. Weston looked at his own hands, large and calloused, resting flat on the table. When he spoke, he did not look up. "Our mother," he said, meaning the woman who had given the three of them up to Thomas Calloway's keeping when they were small, "did not give birth to us. Every person at this table is here because someone chose to keep them." He paused. "Our father never called that less than anything else." "Neither do I." Garrett said, "The condition of the will requires a woman of lawful standing to reside here. It says nothing else. Your presence here is what it has always been." He looked at her. "You are not any less of that because of what you have just told us." The window was open, its 2 inches. The spring morning came through it. Somewhere outside, one of the children was already up and moving in the yard, the quick, light footsteps of a child who woke early and took the morning personally. Nora looked at these three men sitting at a table in a house in Montana and thought about the road from Philadelphia that had taken 9 days and 11 readings of an advertisement and one folded letter that was now slightly lighter than it used to be, and she thought that she had been right to come here. Not because it had been easy and not because it was simple and not because she knew yet what any of it was going to become, but because the door had not closed. She was still in the room. "Thank you," she said, to all three of them, meaning it in the complete and unornamented way she meant things. Fletcher said, "Pass the biscuits," which was his way of saying that the matter was settled and life was continuing, which she had already learned was how he handled transitions that mattered. She passed the biscuits. Weston said nothing, but when she stood to get the coffee pot, she found that he had already refilled her cup again silently while she was looking at the window. Outside in the yard, Eli's round face appeared briefly at the kitchen window, checking, as he did every morning now, whether she was there. She was. He looked at her for one small, serious moment and then went back to whatever he had been doing, satisfied in the way of 4-year-olds who have confirmed that the world is where they left it. Nora turned back to the stove. The morning continued. The ranch continued. And outside on the peak that gave the Callaway land its northern horizon, the last snow of the season caught the early light and began very slowly to melt. The external threat arrived, as most serious threats do not, in the form of something dramatic, but in the form of paperwork. Silas Dodd came on a Wednesday morning in late May, when the last snow had finally surrendered to the season, and the fields were beginning to show the pale green of new growth that makes Montana in spring look like a place that has just remembered it is capable of being beautiful. He came with Sheriff Crow, which was deliberate because a man who brings a lawman to a conversation is a man who has decided that the conversation requires that kind of weight. Dodd was perhaps 45, well-dressed by Bitterroot Fall standards, with the careful grooming of a man who considers his appearance an instrument of his intentions. He had a quality of stillness about him that was different from Weston's stillness. Weston was still in the way of someone who has found quiet. Dodd was still in the way of someone who is calculating. Sheriff Crow was a large, careful man who appeared to take no pleasure in the visit and was conducting it anyway because his office required it. He had the manner of someone who has learned that his job sometimes puts him in the service of interests he does not personally endorse, and has made a professional peace with that fact without making a personal one. Garrett met them on the porch. Fletcher stood slightly behind and to the left. Weston was at the barn and came across the yard without hurrying when he saw the wagon. Nora watched from the kitchen window while she dried the breakfast dishes. She had learned in the past weeks the difference between situations that required her presence and situations that required her to remain available nearby, and this for the moment was the second kind. She could not hear the words. She watched the body language. Dodd spoke at length. Garrett listened without moving. At one point, Sheriff Crow produced a document and held it out. Garrett took it and read it and handed it to Fletcher without looking away from Dodd. Fletcher read it, his jaw tightened in a way she had not seen before. Weston, who had reached the group by then, read over Fletcher's shoulder, and his expression did not change, which was she had learned its own kind of information. The men from town left 20 minutes after they arrived. Garrett stood on the porch and watched the wagon until it disappeared around the tree line, and then turned and came inside, and Fletcher came behind him, and they sat down at the kitchen table, and Garrett put the document on the wood between them. "Sit down," he said to Nora. She sat. The document was a formal complaint filed with the county court, authored as she had suspected from the moment she saw Dodd's face at the window by Silas Dodd. The language was careful and legal, and boiled down to a straightforward assertion that a woman of unmarried status residing in a household with 3 adult men and 6 minor children constituted a moral hazard to said children and to the community, and that the arrangement should be reviewed by the court. Crow had communicated verbally what the document implied, but did not state directly that the review could at its most severe result in questions about the fitness of the household for the care of minors. That sentence lived in the room for a moment before anyone addressed it. "Dodd wants the land," Fletcher said. His voice had a flatness that spoke of something hotter being managed carefully underneath. "He's been asking at the land office for months. He knows about the condition in the will. He thinks if he can create enough disruption before the anniversary date, he can force a situation." "The anniversary is 7 months out," Weston said. "He doesn't need 7 months," Fletcher said. "He just needs enough of a legal complication to make things unstable." Garrett looked at Nora. "There is a straightforward resolution," he said, "from a legal standpoint." She understood what he meant before he finished. "Marriage," she said, "on paper. A woman of lawful standing, which is what the will requires, which is what Dodd is attempting to challenge." "On paper," Garrett said with the precision of a man who is being careful not to make a statement larger than the one he intends. "You would have the legal standing. Dodd's complaint loses its foundation. The will's condition is met." Nora looked at the document. Then she looked at Garrett. Then she said, "Give me 3 days." He held her gaze for a moment. Something in his expression shifted slightly, not what she expected, not frustration at delay, but something closer to acknowledgement. "All right," he said. She stood. She went back to the dishes. Fletcher looked at his brother. Garrett picked up the document. Weston walked back outside. The ranch absorbed the morning and continued. The 3 days that followed were not dramatic. They were in fact ordinary in most of the ways that mattered. The work continued. The meals happened. Owen argued with Nate about something involving a pocket knife and was overruled by both Adeline and Nora in rapid succession. Pearl lost a shoe somewhere between the house and the barn and found it in the chicken coop, which satisfied no one's curiosity about how it got there. Eli, who had been gradually extending his radius around Nora over the past weeks, sat next to her at the breakfast table on the second morning without being invited and ate his eggs with the self-possessed air of someone who has made a private decision and is implementing it. Garrett, on the first morning of the 3 days, left something on the kitchen work table, a piece of paper folded once. Inside it was a rough sketch, not artistic, but precise in the way of a man who thinks in structures and measurements, a plan for expanding the kitchen garden 3 times its current size, with notes on which sections would receive the most sun in summer and which would need windbreak on the north side. In the lower corner in his handwriting, if you want, not you should. Not here is what I have decided, if you want. She kept the paper. On the second day, Fletcher repainted the back step. She had mentioned in passing 3 weeks earlier that the wood was beginning to splinter in a way that would eventually catch someone's clothing or skin. He had apparently been noting this since then and chose the second day of her 3 days to address it, which she thought was probably not a coincidence because Fletcher Calloway did very few things that were coincidences. He painted it and left a folded wool blanket over the railing, which was not a standard feature of step painting, and suggested that he intended the step to be usable again soon. On the third morning before first light, she heard something outside her window. She went to look. In the gray pre-dawn, Weston was in the yard below, not working, just standing, looking up at the mountains. As she watched, he reached into his coat pocket and took out something small and turned it in his hands for a long moment before putting it back. She could not identify it at that distance in that light. She only understood watching him that all 3 of them were waiting, not pressuring, not calculating, waiting in their 3 entirely different ways for her to come to her own conclusion. She had come to it before the 3 days were half done. She had simply needed the time to be certain that what she was choosing was what she actually wanted and not what she was being cornered into. And by the middle of the second day, she knew the difference. She was choosing. The ranch, the family, the complicated and unnameable arrangement of these 3 men and their 6 children in the blue recipe book on the kitchen wall and the carved bird on the windowsill. She was choosing it because she wanted it, not because she had run out of alternatives. On the third afternoon, she found Garrett at the fence line on the western field and said without preamble, "Garrett Calloway, on paper." He stopped what he was doing. "Not because of Dodd," she said, "not because of the will, because I want to be here and I want it to be legal and I want what I choose to have the weight of a choice." She held his gaze. "I want to stay. This is how I stay properly." Garrett looked at her for a long moment, processing what she actually meant rather than what she appeared to mean on the surface. "All right," he said. There was more in those 2 words than his tone made audible. She heard it anyway. The wedding took place the following week in Bitterroot Falls in the office of Judge Beaumont, who was a compact and businesslike man with a firm handshake and the ability to conduct a legal ceremony with dignity and without unnecessary embellishment. Prudence Yates was there, vibrating slightly with the contained energy of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this development. A neighboring rancher served as second witness with his wife. Fletcher wore his good shirt, which was cleaner than his regular shirt, but had seen enough use to carry the character of a garment that has been places. Weston stood at the back of the room with his hands in his pockets and watched the proceedings with the quiet attention he brought to everything. And when the judge asked whether anyone present knew of a reason why the marriage should not proceed, Weston said nothing, which was as close to a wholehearted endorsement as his nature allowed. Garrett signed his name. Nora signed hers. It was the most practical ceremony she had ever witnessed from the inside, and it was also, she thought, entirely fitting. There was nothing in it that was not true. On the way home in the wagon, Eli fell asleep against her side before they had gone half a mile. She shifted her arm around him the way she had seen Adeline do 100 times before automatic his breathing, and he settled deeper without waking, and she looked out at the mountains going past and did not try to name what she was feeling, because the feeling was larger than the available names. Silas Dodd's complaint was withdrawn the following Monday. He left Bitterroot Falls 2 weeks after that. Prudence Yates reported that he had gone to Oregon. Summer came to Cowboy Ranch with the violence of Montana seasons, which do not transition gently but arrive. One day the high meadows were green, and the next they were alive with color wildflowers in quantities that Philadelphia had not prepared her for, whole hillsides given over entirely to the project of being beautiful for the brief window available to them. Garrett was at the northern fence line when it happened. Fletcher was with him. Weston was in the near pasture. Nora was in the kitchen with the window open when she heard Eli cough. She had heard him cough the evening before, a dry sound not productive, the kind that catches in the chest and stays there. She had checked his forehead and found it normal and told herself it was dust. The summer was dry and the air carried things. By the following morning, the cough had weight. She went upstairs at first light and found him still asleep. And when she put her hand to his forehead, he was warm in the way that is not sleep. Warmth, but fever warmth, which is a different temperature entirely. And she had known from the moment her palm registered it what the next several days were going to require. Adeline was at the bedroom door before Nora had finished the assessment. She had heard the way older children in households with younger ones hear everything, and she was standing in the doorway in her nightgown, with her dark braids still loose and her face carrying the drained, bleached look of a girl who has learned that people she loves can become sick and not recover. She had been 4 years old when her mother died, but the body remembers what the mind was too young to fully process, and it remembers it in rooms like this one, at temperatures like this one, at this quality of morning light. "How bad?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Nora said, "which means we treat it seriously and watch." "What do we need?" Nora looked at her, 13 years old, standing in the doorway asking what we need rather than what you need. Adeline Calloway, who had been managing this family's emergencies since she was 11, was asking Nora to be the one who decided. It was a small transfer of weight, but it was not a small thing. "Cold water and clean cloths," Nora said, "and send Weston for the doctor." Adeline went. Garrett rode for Dr. Thaddeus Pryor himself because the distance required the fastest horse, and Garrett was the strongest rider. Weston stayed. Fletcher stayed. The ranch absorbed the crisis the way it absorbed everything by continuing to function around the edges of it. The animals still needing tending, the meals still needing cooking, the world outside the sick child's room still requiring the maintenance of the living. Nora sat beside Eli's bed. She wrung cloths in cold water and laid them across his forehead and the back of his neck. She spoke to him when he was awake, low and steady, the kind of voice that does not ask anything of a sick child, but simply provides the information that someone is present and will remain present. She sang when he was restless in the late afternoon songs that her own mother had sung, simple melodies with the kind of words that do not require concentration to follow. She held his small hand in hers and felt the pulse under the fever-hot skin and counted her own breathing and did not allow herself to think ahead. Adeline came and went, bringing water and broth and the other children's questions, which she filtered and translated and managed with an efficiency that would not have shamed someone twice her age. On the second afternoon, Pearl appeared in the doorway. She did not speak. She was holding something, and after a moment, she walked in and placed it on the bedside table next to Eli's water cup. It was a small, round stone, smooth and gray, with a white vein running through it. Weston's stone, the one Nora had kept on the kitchen windowsill. Pearl had brought it because she thought it might help in the way children think about help, which is often more accurate than adults credit. "Thank you, Pearl," Nora said. Pearl nodded seriously and left. Weston passed through twice that afternoon. He did not stay, but both times he paused at the door long enough to look at Eli and then at Nora. And both times he left something on the chest of drawers just inside the door, a bundle of dried herbs that were medicinal, in some frontier capacity. She did not fully understand, but that made the room smell cleaner. The doctor arrived with Garrett on the afternoon of the second day. Dr. Pryor was a lean, economical man of perhaps 60 who had the matter-of-fact competence of someone who has seen enough illness to have stopped being surprised by it and started being practical about it. He examined Eli with thoroughness and without unnecessary drama and delivered his diagnosis with the same directness. Pneumonia, the beginning stage, serious but not beyond management if managed well. He left medicine and instructions. The instructions were detailed and specific, and he delivered them to Nora because she was the one who had been sitting with the child and he had correctly identified who the primary caregiver was. And as he spoke, she noted each point and asked the questions that needed asking and did not ask the ones that did not. When he left, Garrett walked him to the wagon and came back inside and stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at nothing in particular, which was not his usual posture. Fletcher was at the table. He looked at his brother and then at Nora and did not say anything because there was nothing useful to say. Nora went back upstairs. She and Garrett took turns through the nights. She took the first half, he took the second, and the system worked, not because either of them slept particularly well during their off hours, but because having a system imposed a structure on the witching that made it more manageable than open-ended vigil. On the fourth night, she woke from a doze at the side of Eli's bed to find that Garrett had come in early. He was sitting in the chair on the opposite side, and he was not watching Eli. He was watching her. She did not adjust herself or pretend she had not been asleep. She simply sat up and looked at the child between them, whose breathing was still labored, but had changed slightly from the deeper congestion of the day before. "I think the fever is moving," she said quietly. Garrett looked at Eli. "Yes." He paused. "You have been here every night." "Yes." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She looked at him across the small, sleeping form between them. "I am here because I want to be here, which is the same reason I am at this ranch at all." "I thought we had established that." Something shifted in his face. With the subtlety of a man whose expressions have always been restrained, the shift was small, but it was visible, a loosening of something that had been held tight. "I cannot lose another one," he said. The words came out low and unguarded, the way words come when a person is past the point of managing how they sound, and she understood that he was not speaking only about Eli, or not only about the present version of loss, but about all of it, the accumulated fear of a man who has already sustained one irreplaceable loss and has been carrying the awareness of that vulnerability ever since. She did not offer reassurance she did not have. She did not say he would not lose. She reached across the distance between their two chairs over the sleeping child and put her hand on his forearm. She held it there. He did not move. He looked at her hand on his arm for a long moment. Then he put his other hand over hers briefly and looked back at Eli. They sat like that until Eli's breathing deepened into genuine sleep. The fever broke on the sixth morning. Eli opened his eyes in the gray early light and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then turned his head and looked at Nora, who had been awake for the past 2 hours, monitoring the temperature change she had sensed coming. "Nora," he said, "one word, the first word of a child returning from the place fevers take children reaching for the nearest available shore." She was the shore he reached for. She pressed her hand into his forehead, which was damp now, the good damp of a fever releasing, and said, "Good morning, Eli." "I'm hungry," he said. She laughed. It came out surprised and genuine and slightly ragged from lack of sleep. And from the doorway where she had been standing for the past hour, Adeline made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was his cousin. Nora looked up. Adeline was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed in front of her, which was her default posture, when she was feeling something she had not yet decided whether to show. Her eyes were bright. She was looking at Eli, and then she was looking at Nora, and her expression was the most unguarded Nora had yet seen on her, which meant it was the most true. "I'll make the porridge," Adeline said. "I'll come help," Nora said. They went downstairs together. The aftermath of Eli's illness settled the house into a different arrangement. one that was subtler than the legal change of the wedding, but perhaps more consequential. Something had shifted in the weight distribution of the family's trust, and the shift was not dramatic or proclaimed, but was simply there present in the way Eli reached for Nora's hand when he was still recovering, in the way Harriet began sitting next to her at supper, rather than across the table in the way Owen started bringing his more complicated arithmetic problems to her first rather than to his father. In the way Adeline stopped managing everything alone, it was not surrender. It was something more dignified than surrender. It was Nora thought the decision of a young woman who had been carrying an adult weight since she was 11 years old to set some of it down, not because she could not carry it, but because she had been convinced that she did not have to. The second crisis came from outside the ranch as the first had, but its damage was internal in the way that the most effective attackers always are. Silas Dodd had not, it turned out, entirely surrendered when he left for Oregon. He had left behind a communication. He had written to Cornelius Whitfield, Nora's cousin by a distant branch of the family tree, a man in Philadelphia who had never particularly concerned himself with Nora's existence until it became possible to leverage it. Cornelius arrived at Bitterroot Falls on an August morning and sent a message to the ranch by way of the general store. He brought a lawyer named Pratchett, who had the thin, papery manner of a man who spent most of his life in offices and found outdoor air faintly accusatory. He came to the ranch in the afternoon. Nora saw the wagon from the kitchen window and recognized the posture of someone from before the bearing of a man from Philadelphia who is dressed carefully for a journey he considers beneath him. She did not need to see his face. Fletcher met the wagon in the yard. Garrett came from the back field, still carrying the fence tool he had been using because he had seen the unfamiliar wagon from a distance and had come in without stopping to put down what he was holding, which told her something about his instincts. She went outside. Cornelius Whitfield was 56, well-dressed, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome in an unremarkable way 20 years earlier and had since settled into something more expressive of its character. He looked at Nora with the expression of a man who has decided in advance what the situation is and does not intend to be corrected. "Nora," he said. "Cornelius," she said. "You look well," he said in the tone of someone who finds this fact mildly inconvenient. The lawyer Pratchett produced a document. Cornelius took it and presented it to Garrett with the manner of someone conferring something rather than filing something, which told her the manner was performance. "The marriage," Cornelius said, "is legally questionable. My cousin signed the document under conditions that did not constitute fully informed consent. She was not aware of the complete domestic arrangement into which she was entering. There is grounds to challenge." Garrett took the document. He read it. His face was unchanged. "Furthermore," Cornelius said, "there is the matter of her medical condition, which I understand she did not disclose prior to the arrangement. A court might consider that relevant to the informed consent question on your side." Nora felt the words land the way they always landed in the practiced place that had learned to absorb them. But she also felt something else this time, something that had not been present in all the previous landings, something that felt underneath the old familiar impact like solid ground. She was about to speak when she heard footsteps behind her. Adeline had come out of the house. She was in her work apron, which meant she had been in the middle of something in the kitchen, and she had come out anyway. She stood at Nora's left shoulder and looked at Cornelius Whitfield with the direct assessing gaze she had inherited from her father, and then she looked at the lawyer, and then she looked back at Cornelius. "Nora stayed with my brother for 6 nights when he was sick," Adeline said. Her voice was 13 years old, and it was also something older, something that had been earned rather than acquired. "She knew what to do, and she did it, and she did not leave. Our mother could not stay because she died, but Nora stayed." She paused. "You want to take that away from us? I don't think you can, but I think you should know what you're trying to do." Cornelius looked at the girl with the expression of a man who has not factored a 13-year-old into his calculations and is recalibrating somewhat involuntarily. Nora looked at Garrett. He was looking at Adeline. Something in his face was doing the thing it rarely did, moving visibly, showing what was inside it rather than containing it. He looked at his daughter with the expression of a man who has just seen something that required no interpretation. I will speak, Nora said. She turned to Cornelius. She told him clearly and without particular heat the full sentence from her letter. The part Dodd had supplied to him was accurate. The part that followed it was not in the document Pratchett was holding because Dodd had only sent him the portion that served the argument. She recited the remainder from memory because she knew her own words. I have exhausted all alternatives I could see from where I stood. But I believe there are more than I can imagine yet, and I am choosing to go find one. I did not come here because I had no options, she said. I came here because I chose this option. That choice was mine completely, and nothing you have in that document changes it. Garrett stepped forward, not aggressively, not theatrically, simply forward until he was standing beside her, and his presence beside her was its own statement requiring no elaboration. Fletcher had positioned himself in the space between the lawyer's wagon and the direct path back to it, which was not technically blocking anything, but created a certain clarity about the direction things were heading. Weston had appeared from the barn at some point during the conversation and was standing near the fence in the way he stood when he was present but not performing presence, simply there, a fact like the fence and the mountains and the rest of the landscape that was not going anywhere. Cornelius looked at the assembled situation. The lawyer said something quiet to him. Cornelius looked at Nora for a long moment. There was something in his expression that was almost not quite, but almost the beginning of the discomfort of a man who has badly misjudged what he was walking into. This is not finished, he said. I think it may be, Nora said. He got back into the wagon. The lawyer followed. They drove back toward Bitterroot Falls in the afternoon light, and Garrett watched the wagon until it rounded the tree line and disappeared, and then he turned. He looked at Adeline first. Adeline looked back at him with the expression of a girl who has done a thing and knows she did it right, and is waiting not for praise but for acknowledgement from the person whose acknowledgement has always mattered most to her. Garrett put his hand briefly on her shoulder. One hand, one moment brief as his manner in all things. But Adeline's chin lifted slightly, and she went back into the house without the defensive set to her shoulders that she had been carrying since before Nora arrived. Then Garrett turned to Nora. He still had the fence tool in his hand. He was standing in the yard of his ranch in the August afternoon light, and he looked at her with the concentrated, undistributed attention that she had learned was the most honest thing he had to give, and he said, "Come and walk with me." They walked to the back of the property past the garden and the chicken coop and the root cellar to the fence line at the western edge where the field gave way to the first trees. The mountains were clear in the late light, every ridge visible the sky above them, the deep blue that Montana produced in August as though to compensate for winter. He stopped at the fence. He looked out at the mountains for a moment. Then he set down the fence tool and turned to face her. "I do not say things easily," he said. "You know that. I know that. What I am going to say I have considered. I want you to know that it is considered and not circumstantial." He held her gaze. "I chose to write that letter because the ranch required it, and the children required it, and there was a practical problem that required a practical solution. That is why I wrote the letter. It is not why I want you here now." She waited. "You came here with a secret you were afraid of, and you stayed and you worked and you learned my children before you asked anything of them, and you sat beside my son for 6 nights, and today, my daughter spoke for you in front of strangers, which she has never done for anyone." His voice was even, but there was something beneath the evenness that she could hear because she had learned to hear it the same thing she heard in his silences at supper when the food was exactly right. That is not circumstance. That is not the letter, or the will, or what Dodd wanted, or what Cornelius wanted. That is what you have made here. "Garrett," she said. "I choose you," he said. The words were as direct and economical as everything else about him, with no decoration and no qualification, with the weight of a man who means what he says precisely because he says so little. "Not because I need someone to cook and manage a house, because I want you here. Because when Eli said your name that morning, I understood something I had not let myself understand before. These children are ours. This life is ours. That is enough. It is more than enough. The fence post was warm from the afternoon sun. The mountains were the color they turned in the last hour of light, something between gold and amber, the color of things that have endured enough to earn their beauty. I came here, Nora said slowly, believing that the most I could hope for was to be useful, to be present in a place that needed someone, and to do it well enough that being asked to leave would not seem reasonable. She looked at him. I did not come here expecting to be chosen. Then we are both surprised, he said. She laughed. It was the best kind of surprise, the kind you recognize as right from the inside before you have fully processed it from the outside. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out something small. She thought of Weston standing in the pre-dawn yard 2 months ago, turning something small in his hands that she had not been able to identify at that distance in that light. She understood now what it had been. She understood, too, that he had given it back. The ring was small and silver, set plainly with the simple engraved pattern around the band. Old work. Careful work. My mother's, Garrett said. My father had it made before she died. He did not give it to her in time. I have kept it. He looked at the ring in his palm. I would like it to be on a hand that it was given to. She held out her hand. He put the ring on her finger, and it fit with the modest perfection of things that have been waiting for the right moment rather than the right occasion. The light was going gold across the mountains. Behind the house, she could hear the children beginning the rhythms of evening, Pearl calling for Nate Owens' voice, answering something Harriet had apparently said. And in the kitchen, the sounds of Adeline beginning supper, because some habits run deep enough that even the most significant days still end with someone feeding a family. Winter always ends, Garrett said quietly, looking at the mountains. It was something his father had said. She knew that now. She had heard it in the way he said it, the weight of a phrase that has been passed from one person to another and carries both voices. And the people who stay through it, she said. He looked at her. Become something the cold can never touch, she finished. He did not ask how she knew it. He simply nodded the way he nodded when things were right, and no further comment was required. They stood at the fence line until the light changed, and then they walked back to the house together. And the evening came in over the mountains and settled over the ranch as it always did, with the quiet of a place that has been kept and will be kept again tomorrow. The morning after Cornelius Whitfield drove away from Callaway Ranch for the last time, Nora came downstairs before first light and found Adeline already in the kitchen. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that Adeline was not standing at the stove. She was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a cup of tea, looking at the blue recipe book that Nora had framed and hung on the wall above the work table 2 months earlier. Looking at it the way you look at something you have made peace with. Nora lit the second lamp and sat down across from her. You framed it, Adeline said without looking away from the book. It belongs here, Nora said, where people can see it. Adeline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, she wrote in the margins because she was afraid she might forget something important. That's what she told me once. She said you can't hold everything in your head forever, so you write down the things that matter while you still know them clearly. She was wise, Nora said. She would have liked this, Adeline said, meaning Nora understood not the framed book specifically, but the kitchen as it was now, the ordered shelves and the smell of dried herbs and the carved bird on the windowsill and the lamp burning low in the early morning. She meant all of it, the whole shape of the thing the household had become. Adeline finally looked at her. In the lamplight, 13 years old, with her mother's coloring and her father's eyes in the beginning of something that was entirely her own, she said, I want to make the apple cake again. Not for her birthday this time, just because I want to. All right, Nora said, let me get the book. They made it before the household woke in the quiet of the early morning, with the window open to the September air. And when Adeline added the cinnamon, she added it herself without asking the way Vivian had done, because some things pass from one person to another without requiring instruction. When the cake came out of the oven and sat cooling on the rack, and the smell of apple and caramel moved through the house, they heard one by one the sounds of the family waking. Eli's small feet on the floor above, Pearl's voice, Owen's heavier tread, the creak of Garrett's door. Adeline looked at the cake. She looked at Nora. Something in her face was open in a way it had not been on any morning Nora could remember since her arrival open. The way a window is open when someone has decided the air outside is finally safe to let in. "Thank you," she said. It was the same word she had said in the barn on her mother's birthday. But it meant something different now. Or perhaps it meant the same thing more completely without the reservation that had qualified it the first time. Nora did not say you're welcome. She said she would have been proud of you. And Adeline, who had been managing this family since she was 11 years old, who had never asked for anything she wanted, who had stood in front of a stranger from Philadelphia and defended the woman she had once tried so hard to push away, nodded once and went to set the table. Autumn came to Callaway Ranch the way Fletcher had once described it, with the aspens turning on the hillsides, and the light going golden and slanted, and the air carrying the smell of wood smoke from the first fires of the season. The garden came in, the root cellar filled, the cattle came down from the high pasture, and the ranch settled into the particular industry of preparation that winter requires of people who take it seriously. Cornelius Whitfield did not return. 2 weeks after his visit, a letter arrived from a Philadelphia attorney confirming that no further legal action would be pursued. Garrett read the letter at the kitchen table and put it in the stove without comment, which was Nora had learned his way of treating certain things as finished. The year turned. Eli learned to write his name in October, printing the letters with the intense concentration of someone performing surgery, and brought the paper to Nora first before he brought it to anyone else. She held it and looked at it with the gravity it deserved, because a child's first written name deserves gravity, and said, "That is exactly right." And Eli looked at the paper and then at her, and then went to show his father with the confidence of someone who has already received the most important review. Owen turned 12 in November and requested as his birthday supper the potato soup from the blue recipe book, which Nora made with the sea and the particular attention to temperature that she had learned from months of practice with the Crawford stove and its strong opinions about heat distribution. Garrett went quiet through the entire meal, which the recipe book had long ago taught her was the highest available praise. Fletcher, as winter deepened, began spending his Saturday evenings teaching the older children card games that were of questionable educational value but considerable entertainment. And the sound of his laughter and Nate's arguments, and Harriet's occasional disgusted commentary when she lost, became the soundtrack of those evenings, filling the house with a particular noise of people who are comfortable enough with each other to be loud. Weston carved through the winter sister. The kitchen windowsill accumulated small figures, and the mantel in the front room acquired a row of them, each one distinct, each one the product of the hours Weston spent in the evenings with his knife and his patience, which were both considerable. On Christmas morning, each child found a carving beside their plate. Eli's was a small dog that bore a striking resemblance to the ranch dog that had died the previous spring. He held it with both hands and said nothing, and carried it in his pocket for the next 3 months. Christmas at Callaway Ranch in 1873 was the first Christmas in 2 years that had contained the noise and the disorder and the warmth that the holiday requires to be what it is supposed to be. There was a tree cut from the near woods by Owen and Nate with assistance that was more enthusiastic than effective. There was Prudence Yates's mince pie delivered with ceremony the day before. There was Fletcher's carol singing, which was committed if not technically accomplished, and the children's tolerance of it, which was affectionate if also somewhat pained. Garrett on Christmas evening, after the children had gone to bed, and Fletcher was cleaning up the evidence of the day's cooking, and Weston had gone to the barn for the last check of the night, sat down at the kitchen table, and said to Nora with the deliberateness of a man who has thought about something carefully before saying it, "My father used to say that Christmas was the day you counted what you actually had." She looked at him across the table. "And what do you count?" He considered the question with the seriousness he brought to things that deserve seriousness. "More than I had in November," he said. More than I had in October. He held her gaze. More than I knew to expect when I wrote that letter. Outside, the snow came down slow and steady on Calloway's Peak, and on the fields, and on the roof of the house where his children were sleeping, and on the fence lines he had built, and the root cellar his father had built, and the barn that the three brothers had re-roofed together the summer after Thomas Calloway died because the ranch required it, and they were the ones who would do it. Nora looked at the lamplight on the table, and at the blue recipe book on the wall, and at the carved bird on the kitchen windowsill, and thought about what she had counted, and found that she could not do it quickly because the number was too large for quick counting. Spring came, then another autumn, then another winter, and another spring after that. The years at Calloway Ranch did not pass in the way that years pass in cities, with one day being perceptibly different from the last. They passed in the way that ranch years pass, marked by the turning of seasons and the growth of children and the accumulation of small competencies and the deepening of the daily knowledge that two people build when they are working toward the same things. Owen at 14 began taking on genuine ranch work alongside Garrett and his uncles. He was tall by then, with his father's build beginning to come in, and he learned the cattle work with the same systematic attention he had brought to his arithmetic primer, treating each new skill as a problem to be understood completely before moving to the next. Garrett taught him with the economy of method he brought to everything, and the hours they spent together at the fence line or in the near pasture were largely silent, which suited them both. Harriet at 11 had opinions about everything that was happening in the territory and expressed them at dinner with a confidence that Fletcher encouraged and that sometimes caused Garrett to set down his fork and look at the ceiling in the way of a man reconsidering certain decisions. She read every newspaper that came to the ranch and summarized its contents whether anyone requested a summary or not. Nora gave her a journal for her birthday, and she filled it in 3 months. Nate at 10 had become the kind of child who made friends everywhere he went, which in the context of a ranch 2 hours from the nearest town meant that every trip to Bitterroot Falls resulted in at least 2 new people knowing his name by the time the wagon was loaded. He had Fletcher's sociability without Fletcher's need for an audience, which made him easier to be around for longer periods. Pearl at 9 had decided she wanted to be a doctor. She had formed this intention during Eli's illness and had not wavered from it since, and she pursued it in the way available to a 9-year-old on a Montana ranch in 1874, which was primarily by asking Dr. Pryor very specific questions on his increasingly frequent visits to the valley, and by reading every medical text in the ranch's modest collection until she had opinions about its contents. Pryor, who had no children of his own, found her attentiveness gratifying and began leaving her books. Eli grew. He was 6 when the second spring arrived and 7 when the third came. And by the time he was 8, he was tall enough to reach the second shelf in the kitchen without a step and had lost the last of the round-faced quality that had made him look so young when Nora first arrived. He still found her in the morning by checking whatever room she was in, a habit so established by now that neither of them noticed it as a habit anymore. It was simply the way mornings worked at Calloway Ranch. Fletcher, in the spring of 1876, rode into Bitterroot Falls on a supply run and came back 3 hours later than expected with a particular expression that Weston identified immediately as the expression of a man who has done something he is still deciding how to announce. The something turned out to be Rosalind Vance, a school teacher from the eastern part of the territory who had arrived in Bitterroot Falls the previous month, and who had, in the course of Fletcher buying lamp oil at the general store, somehow ended up in a 40-minute conversation about the merits of various approaches to teaching arithmetic. He married her in the fall. It was a larger wedding than Garrett and Nora's had been, because Rosalind had opinions about weddings, and Fletcher had no opinions sufficiently strong to oppose hers, which was, as Nora observed privately to Garrett, a promising foundation for a marriage. Rosalind was formidably intelligent and almost entirely without pretense, and she and Nora took to each other with the ease of 2 people who recognize in each other a particular kind of practicality that does not require explanation. They argued about things and agreed about other things, and spent many hours at the kitchen table over the following years in the kind of conversation that makes the work go faster. Fletcher built a small house for them on the eastern edge of the ranch, close enough for the convenience of the shared work and far enough for the dignity of a separate life. And they moved in before the first snow that winter. Weston did not marry. This was not a sadness to him as far as Nora could determine any more than his quietness was a sadness to him. He was a man who had identified the things that made his life full and had arranged his life to contain them, and those things were the ranch and the land, in the work of his hands, in the family he had grown up in, and in ways that he would never state, but that Nora understood through years of attention, the small daily evidence that the household was well and the people in it were cared for. He carved through the winters and the summers both. His figures had acquired a reputation in the valley that he had not sought and did not particularly welcome. And people came occasionally to buy what he made, which funded a small comfort he had not had before, in which he spent on tools and on books for Pearl's medical education, and on a particular type of wood that he had discovered produced the finest grain he had ever worked with. He gave these economies no public accounting. They simply appeared in the way that his gifts had always appeared without explanation in the places they were needed. Adeline married in 1879 at 19, which was 2 years later than the Valley's prevailing assumptions about appropriate timing and exactly when she had decided she was ready, and not a moment before. The man was Clement Fairbridge, the son of the rancher whose family had helped raise the new barn in 1876, and he was a patient, thoughtful man who understood early on that Adeline Calloway was going to have opinions about most things and had decided that this was a feature rather than a difficulty. She moved to the Fairbridge property 10 miles north, which was not so far that she could not come back for Sunday dinners, which she did most Sundays for the rest of her life. The morning she left, she came into the kitchen before the household was awake and stood for a long moment looking at the blue recipe book on the wall. Nora came downstairs and found her there. "I was thinking," Adeline said, "that I should write one of these for my own house." "You should," Nora said. "You know more than you think you do." She knew everything, Adeline said, meaning Vivian. "She knew this family," Nora said. "You'll know yours." Adeline turned and looked at her with the directness that had always been one of her most fundamental qualities, the directness she had inherited from Garrett and sharpened through years of managing things that were too large for her age. "You were good for us," she said. Not she would have liked you, not the softer, more qualified things she had offered years ago in the barn. Something plainer, more complete. "I want you to know that I know that." Nora held this for a moment. Then she said, "You all were good for me. I want you to know that I know that too." They embraced, which they did not do often enough, and then Adeline went to finish her packing, and Nora stood in the kitchen in the early morning and thought about the girl who had been kneading bread with her back to the stairs on the first morning, who had told her with such flat certainty that she didn't need help, and thought about the woman walking upstairs to pack her things for a house of her own. The years kept turning. Owen took over the management of the northern fields when he was 20, with Garrett's agreement and Fletcher's enthusiastic endorsement, in Weston's single quiet nod, which was worth more than the combined enthusiasm of most committees. He had grown into a man of considerable competence and a certain quiet good humor that had been in him since childhood, since the boy who had wanted to know if Philadelphia was bigger than Bitterroot Falls, and had decided upon reflection that it probably was too loud. Harriet became a teacher in Bitterroot Falls at 17, filling the position that Rosalind vacated when Rosalind and Fletcher's first child was born, and she brought to the schoolroom the same comprehensive opinions and unshakable confidence in the value of what she was teaching that she had brought to the dinner table for as long as anyone could remember. The children of the Valley learned to read and do arithmetic, and also as a secondary curriculum that was not officially on the schedule to have and defend opinions about what they read. Nate, at 20, bought a small parcel of land adjacent to the Calloway property and built a house on it with help from his brothers and uncles and a rotating cast of the friends he had accumulated over a lifetime of knowing everyone within 20 miles. He raised cattle and kept a large kitchen garden and was known throughout the valley as the person you contacted if you needed something organized because Nate Calloway could organize anything and generally enjoyed doing it. Pearl left for medical training at 18 and carrying with her a trunk full of books that Dr. Pryor had accumulated for her over a decade and a letter of introduction that he had written in terms so unequivocal that the receiving institution, which did not ordinarily accept women, found itself admitting Pearl Calloway before anyone had paused to reconsider. She wrote letters home every 2 weeks without fail addressed to Nora, and Nora wrote back, and this correspondence contained information about medical developments and ranch developments and family news and recipes, and on Pearl's side, the occasional detailed description of a procedure she had performed or observed that caused Fletcher to put down his supper fork when it was read aloud at the table. Eli stayed. He stayed because the ranch was what he knew, and because the cattle work suited the way his mind worked, and because, as he said once to Nora when he was 17, he had never particularly wanted to be anywhere else. He had Garrett's build and Garrett's economy of expression, and Nora had come to believe something of Garrett's interior life, the same depth that showed itself not in words, but in the steadiness of his presence and the reliability of his judgment, and the way he moved through the ranch as though he had grown from it, the way the house itself had grown from it, the way everything worth keeping eventually grew into the land that holds it. He was 20 years old the winter that Garrett's back began giving him trouble, and he absorbed the additional work without announcement, adding it to his own as naturally as the ranch added seasons, without drama and without the expectation of acknowledgement. That winter, with the snow deep on Calloway's Peak and the fires burning in every room, and the smell of wood smoke and pine throughout the house, Nora sat with Garrett in the evening after supper in the way they had been sitting together for 20 years in the kitchen or by the fire in the front room, and she thought about the woman who had arrived at this ranch afraid and carrying a secret and certain that the most she could hope for was to be useful. She thought about what usefulness had turned out to mean. She thought about Vivian's recipe book on the kitchen wall and about the second recipe book that Adeline had written for her own house, and about the letter she had received that morning from Pearl, describing a difficult birth she had attended, with a result that had gone well, and about Eli's footstep on the porch that evening, as familiar as the creak of the house in cold weather, as fundamental as the sound of wind on the mountain. She thought about the advertisement that had stayed in her coat pocket for 11 days, growing soft at the creases. She thought about the particular arithmetic of a life, the way the things you think you are losing turn out to be the things being cleared away to make room for what is actually going to happen. "What are you thinking?" Garrett asked. He asked it the way he asked things, simply without requiring an answer of any particular shape. "I was thinking about the day I arrived," she said, "at the station, when the stagecoach stopped. You looked like you were deciding something," he said. "I was." "What did you decide?" She looked at the fire, at the framed recipe book visible through the kitchen doorway, at the row of Weston's figures on the mantel accumulated over 20 years, a small carved population of the life that had been lived in this house, at the ring on her finger, which was the same ring it had always been, warm and plain and exactly the right size. "I decided not to look at the mountains yet," she said. "I told myself I'd look later when I understood what I had walked into." "And did you ever look?" "Every day," she said, "for 20 years. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something was right and needed no further comment. Then he reached over and put his hand over hers, as he had done on the fourth night of Eli's fever, as he had done on the fence line in August, 20 years gone, as he had done in 10,000 small moments, across the length of a life that had turned out to contain more than either of them had known to expect. Outside, the snow came down on Calloway's Peak and on the fields and on the roof of the house where some of the children had grown up and left and others had stayed, and on the kitchen garden that had been expanded 3 times over 20 years, and on the graves in the small cemetery on the western hill where Thomas Calloway lay, and where Vivian lay, and where the land itself seemed to hold them the way it held everything worth keeping, with patience and without letting go. The house was quiet in the way it was quiet in the evenings now, with fewer children in it than there had once been, and the noise they had made replaced by a different kind of fullness. The fullness of a place that has been lived in long enough, that it holds the sound of everything that has ever happened in it. Nora looked at Garrett in the firelight. At 22 years of evenings and mornings and arguments about cattle and quiet Saturdays and the seasons turning and the small daily accumulation of a life that had been built not from what she had originally expected, but from what had actually been here waiting. She thought about the woman who had arrived with a carpet bag and a folded paper and a practiced smile, and the certain knowledge that the most she could hope for was to be useful, to be present in a place that needed someone. She had been useful, she had been present, and she had been chosen, which was the thing she had not known to expect, and which had turned out to be the thing that made everything else possible. The fire settled in the grate. The wind moved over the mountain. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked with the habitual voice of a structure that has been kept through many winters and intends to be kept through many more. She had come here afraid. She had stayed. And the cold had never touched her again.